This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 1970, an article appears in the New York Times with the headline, "Statisticians Charge Draft Lottery Was Not Random." The article laid out how an analysis of the Vietnam War draft lottery, which was intended to be a random drawing according to birth date, well, that drawing disproportionately picked, for instance, men born in January over men born in December. Obviously, the consequences of this, the implications of this were huge. It tapped into a big conversation about the draft itself, those who were in the sample to be drawn in that lottery and those who had avoided it. And also, in interesting ways, this was a big moment for statisticians. We got an email from a listener, Thomas, about this, and Thomas wrote us, I'm quoting here, "I'm not sure if you've done something on the Vietnam draft, but this is a rather minor, nerdy, and esoteric event that could provide a hook into the fairness of the draft." And Thomas, I'll just say, you get the show with an email like that. When someone writes us and says, this is a rather minor and nerdy angle on a big story, I'm just like, say less.
Done.
We're on it. Done. So here to discuss, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley is on break today. She's not joining us, but as it happens, we had lined up a great guest for this. So sliding seamlessly into that third seat is none other than Walt Hickey, my former colleague at 538, a lover of all the ways in which stats and culture and the real world intersect. So Walt, thank you for doing this. And I guess just by dint of the calendar, you're our first guest for 2024.
Hey,
what an
there we
honor.
Go. Thank you for having me. I dig the show so much. I'm so happy to be back.
Yeah, and the last time you were on the show was for your book, which you wrote last year called You Are What You Watch, and people should go check that out. And that was about pop culture and stats and how data helps us understand culture. This is a story about how stats and stats analysis kind of uncovered a really interesting moment in U.S. history and a phenomenon. And Walt, when I reached out to you, just this kind of person who loves interesting stats stories, I asked you, did you know about this? And I think you mentioned that in one of your graduate classes or something, there was a little case study about this or something?
Yeah, so it comes up. It's because it's a wonderful government data set, and there's a few, like, it's fairly instructive of, this thing that we call randomness, and it's a good illustration of, how one can detect, when something is and isn't random, and it's cool. It's got some academic potential, I would say, as well. It just kind of came across at some point in college. And what is random, and how do we attain true randomness, is a really exciting and compelling question that we could talk for hours on, but we are not going to do that.
So to frame the kind of two interesting statistical stories floating here, there's the specific one about this question of randomness in the draft. But then also, I think you're alluding to, we can get to this, but the draft itself serves as a really interesting data set where you can study the consequences of people who were drafted. It's a very interesting random sample, right?
Yeah.
And so we'll get a little bit to that and all the studies over the decades after the Vietnam War draft that looked at that. But Niki, do you have thoughts on this particular scandal story about the draft itself?
Well, in particular, like this idea of, first of all, the randomization not being really random, it's such a great statistical study because the stakes are so high.
Yeah.
Right. In most cases, statistics are novel and interesting, and they are important. But in this case, like the idea that it was non-randomized, people can point to that and say, my son, daughter, cousin had to go to war and potentially die because this thing that looked randomized wasn't randomized. And what's fascinating about this particular story, so the draft lottery is set up for 1970. And there are lots of different ways to randomize things. I think probably, Walt, you can tell us the various ways that you can. But in some ways, they were putting on a show of the lottery. Mm-hmm. And it was that show itself that compromised the randomness, because all of the things that they were doing to kind of show that this was being done fairly, to make it look transparent, actually contributed to the flaws in their method.
Yeah.
So November 26th of the previous year, 69, President Nixon orders a selective service system to establish a random selection sequence for induction. And it basically just says there should be a lottery based on birthdays, but no other instructions on methodology beyond that, which I think is exactly the kind of thing, if you're a statistician, the kind of vague instructions you get and you have to develop a methodology. And Walt, do you have anything to say about kind of how they decided to put randomness into this system?
Yeah, so just to back out a little bit, they pick birthdays. So the balls, so to speak, in the hopper are going to be dates that are dates of birth. And so if you were born on September 14th, your number came up first. And so everybody born on September 14th was then, the first in line to be drafted. And so it basically ranked 366 days, or I think
366. No, 66, yeah. Right? They have that leap year in there.
Yeah. In order of when you're in the queue to go to Vietnam. And so, on one hand, you don't really need to randomize birthdays because your human births are already pretty random. Like, obviously, there's one contributing factor, but, there's no huge spikes in birth over the course of the year. If you started at January 1 and then ended at December 31, you would randomly select effectively the American population. So, that being said, that's not really fair. It's hard to just kind of pick the first date of a month and say, that's when the draft starts. And so to kind of wash their hands of some of that, they did the classic casting of lots. And so, an element of this that took some people by surprise was that, we have random number generators, or pretty good ones, right? And they could have just called the boys at Rand and said, hey, take it to the computer, randomize the 366 dates, get them back to us, and then we will read them out on the television. And that would have been a very good random way to do it. And they decided against doing that and made it a bit of a production. And they had big boxes full of the dates, and they would draw them, and a congressman would go there and be like, here's the first date drawn, and then they would show it for everyone and that kind of stuff, which I think was an interesting choice for a couple of reasons, one of which is number one, it's the same reason that when we do lotto drawings, you'll have the balls bouncing around and it'll be a 1, a 3, because it does show we did draw this in front of you randomly, but it also invites, what if you goof up on that?
Yeah. And people want to see that in front of them, which is an interesting sort of psychological thing.
It's the television era, and
right.
There's an inherent mistrust of the government at this point. And so, you do kind of, I empathize with them when they're yeah, no, they do need to see that this is being done, but we can get to it, but that exact thing is what ended up botching it.
So 366 blue plastic capsules. Each one has a birth date in front of it, and they're hand-drawn out of a box. And this is a TV show, right, Niki?
Yeah.
It is. It's televised. And that, I think, is what was just saying, is what's so important about it, because trust in the government, especially about the Vietnam War, had gone way, way down as of 1968. There really was a sense that the draft was unfair, that it was targeting people who were poor, people who were not white. And so there was this real sense that we need to do something to show, first of all, to do the draft differently, to push back against these critiques, but also to show that this is a fair and random process. So that's why you get a kind of spectacle around it. It kind of feels a little bit like the Hunger Games, which is a tough parallel. But the idea is, again, even if we're not achieving the randomness, we have to make people feel like this is a fair, transparent, and just kind of chance-based system. So we pull all of the favor and bias out of it. The story of how it goes wrong is really interesting, because they put those little blue balls that you were talking about, Jody, in by month. So that first they put all of the January balls in, and they stir it around, and then they put all the February balls in, and they stir it around, and they keep doing that until they get to December. And so by the end of it, the January balls have been stirred into the mix 12 times, and the December balls have only been stirred once. And you actually get more December dates pulled out early because they haven't been as well mixed in. And so if you were born later in the year, odds were your number was going to be much higher, and therefore you were much more likely to be drafted.
When you first hear about this case, study, it takes you like a second, because the thing about randomness is that, like, to look at truly random data doesn't always look random, right? You should actually have clusters of things together. You should have gaps, right? You shouldn't have a fairly uniform distribution of, let's just say, dots on a grid, because that actually isn't random, right? It looks random. Your brain might think it's random, but it's not. It's just kind of a more uniform distribution. You do want to see clustering. You do want to see these things coalesce around each other a little bit. You want to see things that don't entirely look random, because that is incidentally why it is random. And so, so at first glance, you might hear like, oh yeah, the draft lottery had a disproportionate number of people from certain months drawn. And you might be like, that's not really a thing. But if you look at the data, actually, no, you can actually draw a fairly linear like relationship between what month you were born in, and you were able to kind of fairly distinctly say that it was, potentially not well mixed and not well done and not in fact random.
And is that in part because the sample size is big enough here that it will smooth over some of that natural clustering? That, like, I guess I'm saying there was a confidence here that we can see that there isn't pure randomness in this sample size.
Oh, we totally can. Yeah, you can run it through fairly standard statistical software and figure out essentially when the expectation of what you would have versus just when things are outside of that possible range of statistically viable things, you can kind of start dismissing the idea that an allocation is entirely random.
So I feel like I'm back on the 538 podcast here asking about asking a very naive question to someone who really knows stats very well. But I will do that right now. And just to point out, this analysis starts to show that the average draft position for men born in January was 201, while the average number for December was 122. So if you were in December, you were at a distinct disadvantage. And then, as you were hinting at, you can run all these tests and simulations to kind of test out the randomness in this. And so the odds of the linear decline in draft order, so basically people determined that the odds of something like this result happening were 50,000 or 100,000 to 1. And then, in reading about this, I'm going to read a phrase to you, Walt, and you're going to tell us what it means. But it said, a Monte Carlo simulation found that the probability of a random order of months being this close to the 1 through 12 sequence expected for unsorted clips was 0.09. So I'll confess that I spent many years at 538 listening to people refer to Monte Carlo simulations and me just kind of nodding along and being like, oh yeah, the Monte Carlo simulation. But put that in layman's terms. I mean, what are the kind of ways that you can use simulations to test and say, how expected would this result be?
Sure. So Monte Carlo simulations, I actually have a really good example here that I wrote in a vaguely past life. It was my first run at Business Insider when I was just little baby intern, and essentially the game of Monopoly is a game that is basically you can go around the Monopoly board, and at first glance all of these these properties all kind of look the same probability wise, but that's not the case. When there's the go to jail box in one of the corners that sends you back across the board diagonally, what that actually does is it makes that run between jail and go to jail more likely to be landed on, right? And we can accomplish that because we can simulate thousands of games of Monopoly, as it were, because it's simply a dice roll, right? We can roll dice after dice and imply how often one would hit this. And we can see very distinctly that there's an elevated number of levels on, the red properties, right? Rather than, say, the Baltic cavities and all that kind of stuff. And so, essentially, Monte Carlo simulation is just that kind of, we're going to simulate the randomness, to do repeated random sampling, to see if what we call a steady state solution emerges, or the underlying inherent probabilities of drawing these individual numbers, or perhaps drawing these individual places on a Monopoly board. And as a result, it kind of allows us to, if not like solve the idea of why the statistics of a situation are off, one might say, it allows us to essentially simulate our way towards an answer and kind of grind it out. It's rather fun. It's a good way to kind of tackle complicated systems And for folks who have a familiarity with statistics, I hope that you understand how I'm like trying to get this into more lay terms. But it is basically, if you do something enough times, you'll begin to arrive at a viable possible realm of examples in which case things can come. So and I would say that, doing that kind of stuff would illustrate that perhaps, it's rather difficult to, in a truly random system, get this kind of heavy December issue and rather light January to the extent that they really did.
Right. They pinned it as a 0.09% chance that this kind of result would have happened. And so I think that illustrates.
And like naively, like again, I don't recall the exact manner in which they did this, but a 0.09% chance means that if they ran, I believe, 10,000 simulations, 9 of them were this messed up, which allows us to kind of reject the idea that this was truly random, right? It would have to be an exceptionally rare case, straining probability to its very, very edge, which would just straight up is unlikely.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
The way that this all surfaces, earlier we were talking about like the stakes for something like this. Like if you had a very high number, your life was at best going to be disrupted for a few years, but you were, exposed to lethal situations, right?
Yeah.
You were exposed to really potentially horrific wartime conditions. And so it was a doctorate student in computer planning, a 24-year-old guy named David Stadolsky, who is looking at these statistical analyses that you're talking about and saying, look, this isn't right. This isn't what we were promised. And he filed a suit in federal court to try to get this draft lottery thrown out because the executive order that Nixon had put out had called for a random drawing, and it wasn't a random drawing. So basically he's asking them to throw out these results. You can't use this particular draft lottery. You've got to do it again.
And the result of that is that they did not redraft. I mean, I think that would have been an even bigger scandal and just invited even more speculation and so forth. But it is telling that when they then go hold the next draft lottery on July 1st of 1970, they turned to the National Bureau of Standards and they got some scientists in there and they created 78 random permutations of the numbers 1 through 366 using random numbers selected from published tables. And so clearly, I think there was, I don't know, there's an acknowledgement there that, okay, this little blue balls shaken up in a fishbowl scenario wasn't very effective.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the smoking gun of this all. Like where they did realize that they did not do this one particularly well.
Though that is also related to, and I'm want to kind of get your bigger thoughts on this. That is also related to where we started, which is this question of trust, right? And trust in the process. And, one of the things I learned at 538 and just in kind of watching both statistical storytelling and just media in general is that, if someone wants to have a suspicion about something, they will find a reason to have a suspicion about it. And so, in this scenario, and we see this with like voting machines all the time, right? People are like, oh, they're so unsophisticated, these punch hole things. Why would we trust them? And then they move to like a computer and they're like, I don't know what's going on inside that computer. Like, right, that could be connected to Venezuela. Who knows? And so it's like, no matter what your system is, if you don't have faith in the institution, you will probably find a way to critique it. And so I'm sure there were people who were like, why would I trust someone from the Bureau of Statistics to open up some dusty old book and tell me what number they saw? I want to see the fishbowl with the numbers getting pulled out. So I'm just curious, both of you tell stories for the larger public about complicated things. I mean, what does this tell us about trust and faith and storytelling as much as it does about, the actual draft lottery?
Yeah, I think, like, I am sympathetic to doing it in the fishbowl style. Again, like, there's a reason that when we do lottery drawings, which do necessitate trust, you can't operate a lottery in America successfully if people don't trust that the outcomes are random. And there's a reason that midway through the news, they go over to the little bouncing balls, and then they draw them one by one. But that has been a system that was deliberately designed to, like, those have been running and mixing for quite a while at that point before they're open. And so, like, I'm very sympathetic to the need to put a little bit of a display on, right? I'm sympathetic to you need to have the wheel spin at least once on Wheel of Fortune in order to get a perfect, go, right? And so I think that we do need these kinds of drawings, particularly ones with as mortal implications as this, to be done in public and with clarity. And I think a lot of the time, the instinct sometime is that, we just get it done, just have the computer run in the basement. And there's always going to invite skepticism. But going back to, our time at 538, like a kind of a foundational idea of a lot of what we did and in many ways still continue doing is that we do work in public. We publish the data for which we obtained our information and invite people to scrutinize it. We would publish the code often that we would use to compute stories. And in journalism in general, which is a field that is at times getting skepticism of what they do, I think data journalism has a lot of power because, when you work in public and you show, here's the numbers, how I arrived at this conclusion, doubt me if you want, that can be a very, solid way to inure people to trust what you're attempting to do. So I feel like working in public is actually a rather good element of the story, even if they did manage to botch the actual mix.
And I think the bigger story about trust is that you can't image manage your way out of a crisis of faith that goes much, much deeper than just the draft, right? The real crisis here was both an unfair and unjust war that was happening in Vietnam and the way that the government and the media colluded to lie to the American people about it. And so the problem was that you were sending people against their will to fight in this war. And regardless of how you run the draft, I mean, my dad was drafted before the lottery, and he was drafted because he was 25. They picked kind of the oldest people in the selective service batch to send over before the lottery, and because he was a working class guy who wasn't going to college and he didn't have connections, and so he just had to go. And then you have all these deferments, even when you have the lottery and people with connections, you get kind of plum positions. And, that's the problem. And the lottery might paper over that by giving it an air of transparency. But, there's a reason why the troop levels in Vietnam go way, way down during the same period, because it's unsustainable, because the policy itself is the problem.
Yeah. That's such an important point, and we should do more episodes about the draft. But the larger sense that this is a rigged game anyway, and so this just then sits on top of that. All right, as we wrap up, the other interesting thing here, and our original emailer Thomas pointed this out, that actually he had a professor in grad school who had done some work around this. But this idea of the draft as a random sample that then you can kind of study the consequences of into the years and decades since is really interesting. But basically, it's like you can see economic outcomes. You can see how people's lives played out if they happened to be randomly selected for the draft versus not. Do you have thoughts on that? And then in general, do you have thoughts on kind of like how often you are presented with these kinds of interesting randomized sample sets like this with such huge consequences? Yeah.
What's really fun is when you find something that the economist crowd calls a natural experiment, which is essentially a situation in which people specifically sorted themselves into a control group, and as well as a group of people that was in some manner experimented on. In the book, this can be I talked to people who, the people who saw things versus those who didn't when it came to cinema, people who were in countries where things could be released versus couldn't. And in this situation, obviously, you can figure out what exposure to a war or delaying your entry into the labor force by a year or two can have on your economic lifetime output. It's just a very rich set of data that can also be used used, again, to essentially, randomly divide this population medically into different cohorts, right? If you're attempting to potentially do a long-term study on health outcomes as related to this. So this is just one of those rare situations where you have a truly random, at least later on, division between a group of people, and it allows you to kind of look back in retrospect as if, not just were they dividing folks into different draft orders, but they were also, essentially splitting people into control and non-control groups.
Really fascinating, and maybe we will return to some of that as a legacy of the war, and certainly we will return to the draft as a really interesting historical phenomenon. But one more mention of Thomas's initial email, because I just want to point out that he sent this to us and said, rather minor, check. Nerdy, check. Esoteric, check. I think we've done it. Thank you. But no, this is really, really, truly fascinating. Walt, I can't think of a better guest to come on and help walk us through this. So, Happy New Year to both of you. Thank you, Thomas, for being the first listener email of the year that we get to. Listeners, keep sending us ideas. But Walt Hickey, the book is You Are What You Watch. Go check it out. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have you on again later this year for sure.
Oh, please. I love this. Thank you so much for having me. I really love the show.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
Congressman Perney is representing the United States, the Military Affairs Committee of the House, and he also is a senior Republican president who has been the watchdog committee of this selective service system. And we're going to ask him to choose September 14th.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. We'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia from